G'day. Welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. No one wants to talk about divorce, but with around 1 in 3 marriages ending in divorce, it's a fact of life that you or someone you care about will live through one. Divorce is traumatic for all parties concerned, especially if there are kids involved. And I've always said, wealth is hard to accumulate, but it's bloody easy to lose. Spending 20 years as a financial advisor, I observed time and time again how divorce would become a massive erosion of family wealth. And a lot of that wealth could have been saved if the people involved knew the process, got the right type of lawyer, and were better able to negotiate or deal with the emotional complexities. And that leads me to our guest today, Murray Crawford. Murray's the founding partner of CLO Lawyers in Toowoomba, Queensland. He's had a long and experienced legal career, but these days he spends his time focusing on family law. Murray and I are going to work through what you need to know if you or one of your family or someone you just care for goes through a divorce. Now, before we get started, we have to keep the lawyers happy, so I'm going to give you a disclaimer. The information contained in this podcast is general in nature and for educational purposes only. It's not financial advice, it's not legal advice, and no one should act on the information without appropriate specific advice for your particular circumstances. I'm a former financial advisor and I've chosen to no longer be licensed, and I cannot and will not give you specific or personal advice in this podcast. So now the lawyers are happy, let's get cracking. Welcome, Murray.
Good morning, Ben.
Morning, Murray. Okay, now I want to kick off first, if I could, with a little bit of a background on yourself. So you focus on family law, but that hasn't always been the case. And you've got a really unique view on the legal side of things because of your varied experience. So can you just start off, Murray, with a bit of a brief summary of your background and experience for me?
Yeah, well, Ben, I'm just going to mention the fact that my father was a logging contractor in Gippsland in Victoria. So I'd be one of the few lawyers in this country who's got an articulated truck driving licence. Not that I've been behind the wheel for the last 30-odd years, but so I do come from that small business background. Went to uni, the only person in my family to go to uni, and did a combined commerce and law degree at Monash back in the 80s. So I've been around a long time. I worked for 8 years as a young solicitor, property solicitor in country Victoria. And then I did 8 years in academia where I ended up teaching undergrad, postgrad income tax and capital gains tax and other areas like that to other lawyers. And in 2001, I decided to set up my own practice. So that's 20 years ago that I've been in practice myself, and I started focusing on property and commercial work, which were my key areas of interest. And then I've built the business to the stage where 10 years ago, I had the matrimonial experience that 50% of the population have, but I also had excellent people working with me who could do the work that I'd always done, and arguably, better than I do it myself. So I decided to, based on my experience in the matrimonial sector, to do a master's degree in family law and really tool up, and being a bit older, I could do the family law within the practice. So for the last 10 years, I've focused on family. I think, almost unique perspective that gives me is that I'm helping people sort out their property matters, but I've got a very long history in property and commercial law and income tax. So it's not just family law. Family law requires a knowledge of family law. That's why I've done the master's, but it also, to be a good family lawyer with people or for people who have got business, farms, that sort of thing, then to have the knowledge experience that I've got, I think adds a good foundation.
And that's the unique perspective, is being able to focus on one area but have a good understanding of all the other areas, because they all play in together to get the best result for the person going through, as you said, the matrimonial issues, which is a nice way of saying divorce.
Yes. You got to turn a negative into a positive, Ben.
I agree. Now, you mentioned some statistics, roughly 50% of all relationships break down. And people always say to me, well, what do I need to do, Ben? Like, what's the first thing I need to do? So what I'd like to know is if If I'm or someone, one of my loved ones, for example, is thinking about separating or divorcing, what's the first thing they should actually do?
Look, I'm going to give you an answer to that may not sound typical of a lawyer, but the very first thing, as far as I'm concerned, is it definitely finished? If it's not finished, get some help. You've got kids. You want to retain your family if you can. So firstly, is the relationship irretrievably broken down? If it is, then get some help for yourself as well, because you're going to need, it's going to be a difficult process. It's never easy. Going into a separation situation, it's a bit like entering a tunnel. Until you've got your settlement all done and dusted, you're in that tunnel and you're hoping that you're going to come out the other end. I've had the experience. I know what it's like. Now, in terms of, well, okay, I'm in the tunnel now. There is no set rule that applies, but I always suggest that without looking like you're trying to raid the kitty, make sure you've got some money for yourself, especially the ladies that I act for. I had a client once who came up to visit her son and daughter-in-law from Adelaide, and she drove up. When she got here, she got a text message from her husband of 36 years saying, yeah, it's off, and I've just taken all $284,000 we had in our offset account. Good luck. She had to then rely on the charity of her son for the next 6 months while we sorted that out. So try to get yourself some financial provision without looking like you're trying to snatch and grab is a very important thing. And some quality counselling. Now, counselling is becoming much more acceptable in terms of, what it represents these days than arguably what it did in past days, so that you can keep yourself mentally as agile and fit as you can to go through this unpleasant experience. In terms of mechanical things, you will probably make a new will and a new power of attorney, because by the time it gets to that stage, you're going to be, your former spouse is going to be provided for in the property settlement anyway, so you don't want them to inadvertently double up, if you haven't made a new will. And there are some other matters like that as well. But the main thing, as far as I'm concerned, is it definitely finished? If it's not, then work it out if you can, because you've got a family. If it is, well, okay, you go into the tunnel, keep yourself fit, make some provision for yourself if you can, and get some advice fairly early on. The advice from this lawyer is not going to be, let's unleash the dogs and go. It's going to be what I just said.
I think that's really important, Murray. One of the things that always crops up as well is people, I think, naively think that divorce is only if you're married. But divorce in family law, because family law is the legislation, shall we say, that guides that, living with someone or de facto is just the same as divorce. For the young people out there, this is probably very important. So if you've got kids that are getting out of uni or high school, etc., and cohabitating with someone, how long do you have to be together or cohabitating these days to be considered the same as a married couple when it comes to family law? That's
an excellent question. A lot of people think, well, look, if I get involved in a relationship, I'm going to lose half of everything I've got, straight away. The law's actually got some common sense about it. In a de facto situation, firstly, de factos are covered by the Family Law Act, just like married couples are. However, one major difference, if you haven't been in a genuine domestic relationship for 2 years, then you don't have the application of the Family Law Act, which means you've sort of got 2 years to work out whether you're going to be serious with this person, or if not. And if you're not, well, you can pull out of that relationship, no harm done. You take back, whatever you've put in terms of money, whatever. But there is no application of the Family Law Act, so you can't lose half straight away. The other thing is that even when you go past that 2-year period, if you were to separate subsequently as a de facto couple, say up to even 5 years, it's still treated pretty much on a strict sort of a financial basis. So again, whatever you put in, you pretty much take that back out. It's only after you've had children or you go past that sort of 5-year period where the contributions start to be recognised more so from a non-financial perspective. A bit like dropping a Barocca into a glass bin, up to 5 years, you take the Barocca back out, it's pretty much as it was. But after that, it's starting to erode around the edges and it gets a bit more complex after that.
So where have I heard the 6-month thing from, Murray? I mean, I keep hearing all the time from people that are probably uninformed and saying, once you've been in a relationship and living with someone for 6 months, all bets are off. Is that just a wives' tale, shall I say?
I would have to say wives' tale, exactly. As I mentioned, I think the law, and the law is often an ass. And in family law, you might not expect it to be much different, but it is. There are principles called justice and equity principles that underpin the Family Law Act. And that says if you haven't been in a genuine domestic relationship for 2 years, you don't have the application of the Family Law Act. You can't claim any benefit from it, and you're not subject to losing half your estate or your wealth after 6 months of knowing someone. That's not fair. That wouldn't be just and equitable. So, yeah.
Yep. And obviously there's variations in people's circumstances that mean that the courts or the legal system would look at things differently. But on average, it's relatively fair. So, okay, Murray, what's the process you would follow through? So the first thing you need to do is the relationship, actually over? Am I in a position where I've got a little bit of a nest egg put aside to be able to fund myself, and then getting some counselling to help you personally deal with it? We're not talking marriage counselling. We're talking personal to give you that mental, what was the words you used, Murray? Was it stamina?
Yes, that'll do. Yeah. You need a bit of that.
The mental stamina to be able to get through. But what's the process you follow? Because I know you've got to be separated for a certain period of time. And also there's the whole property settlement versus divorce and, dealing with the kids, etc. So to be very concise of my question, what's the process you actually need to follow to get to the end?
We probably need to be aware, Ben, that in Australia we don't have the same concept of divorce that we see on American television. Technically, a divorce in Australia is really just killing the marriage certificate so that one of you can, or either of you can go and remarry without committing that old crime called bigamy. Now, it's interesting double standard. If you're in a de facto relationship and you end that relationship, you don't have to get a divorce. You can go and enter a new relationship. But as far as a married couple is concerned, if you want to remarry, you must get divorced. But that's the only application of divorce. It's fairly straightforward. It's a process. Some people do it by themselves online. Others, have us do it for them. The elephant in the room is always the property settlement, which is a different thing to divorce. It's basically a financial audit of your life. That's when you're going to need a lawyer, because we have to establish your property pool. We've got spreadsheets and things that we use to create a balance sheet to get the pool quantified to begin with. Then we look at all of these things called contributions throughout the marriage. And I often quote a sort of a caveman metaphor that in a typical sort of a relationship, dad might go out and risk his life, find a carcass and bring it home, or kill something and bring it home, while mum stays at home in the cave. And please, I'm not being in any way sexist here, but the other party or partner stays at home in the cave, looks after the kids, keeps everything clean and tidy, so that if one has been the major breadwinner but the other has been the major homemaker, those contributions set each other off and, will normally come out to around about 50-50. There's a host of other rules that go around working out who actually has contributed what to the marriage or the matrimonial pool. And then we look at something called, future needs. This is lawyer language, but it's looking at the ability of each one to earn an income going forward, and it's mainly applicable in a long relationship. So, in my case, 26 years, I can't just continue on a legal practice earning X dollars a year and have the wife of 26 years who can't. She has to do something else. So you've got an adjustment that is necessary there to underpin the one that has a lesser capacity going forward to create an income for themselves, may have to do some retraining and that sort of thing. So establishing the pool, looking at the contributions and the future needs arguments, as lawyers call them, then you pretty much come to, you hope, an agreed overall apportionment of the overall pool. And the pool is literally a pool. It's not individual items. You chuck the whole lot into a bucket, and you come up with an overall amount. And then it's a question of, how are we going to do this? Is one going to refinance the matrimonial mortgage, pay the other one out? take over the property themselves? Are we going to sell the property? And usually people will try and divide the properties between them, or property between them. And that includes superannuation, by the way. And you can split superannuation if there's not quite enough cash in the pool to be able to achieve a just and equitable apportionment. You can use superannuation splitting as well. And so once that's all agreed to, then the lawyers continue their work, hopefully in a collaborative manner, and produce the documents that will evidence that. And there are two styles of document that can be used. The traditional approach, which I prefer in most cases, is we call them consent orders. So it's an application that goes into the court with some orders that the parties have already signed that they would agree to the court making, and that gets looked at by a registrar in the court. And the other is a binding financial agreement, which is an agreement entered into directly. It doesn't go to court. And there are benefits and disadvantages of each of those two methods. But once that's done, then your settlement is done. The tunnel that I mentioned earlier, you've got to the other end of. And the idea is then that each party can move forward, shut the gate, as it were, padlock the gate, hopefully, and you can go forward with impunity from the other. You don't have to worry about, as long as you've done everything right in your procedural aspects of your settlement, you don't have to worry about having another tap on the shoulder in the future. And that's so important if you're going to enter into a further life relationship, as I've done. You want that gate to be closed. You don't want any doubts to affect that further relationship. So, yes, that's the process.
And Murray, so obviously there would be some forks in the road there, wouldn't there? You know, if you get to the point where you, for the lack of a better term, you have a bucket full of assets and then a bucket full of income that's coming in, you negotiate together to come up with a split which you think's appropriate based on various means. And then if you come to an agreement, essentially you sign off on it via the courts or via an agreement. The other option is then when people get into a dust-up, which happens, I'm guessing, more often than not. And from your experience, Murray, is that normally when people say, okay, well, our pool's worth, there's 100 units in the pool of wealth that we've got, and I think I deserve 60%, and the other person thinks they deserve 60%, and then they can't come up with that number. Is that usually where the breakdown normally happens, or is it more often than not when it's about specific assets? Like I want the home and I want the farm or whatever it might be.
Interesting. In terms of the amount of money involved, it doesn't seem to be a factor. I've got a matter on at the moment where the asset pool is quite skinny, very skinny in fact, but they are arguing. So what tends to kick in here a bit is the psychological factor. And if one party goes and repartners quickly, that can be like throwing petrol on a fire too. But at some point, look, I have a mantra that I operate by, and that is I'd rather mediate than mutilate. I'd rather settle than fight, because although I'm a lawyer and I make money from it, I don't get any joy out of, it's just not within me to fan the flames of discontent. If we can, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if we can get this matter resolved, get it done quickly, it may not be completely to your liking, but it's within the range and you follow my advice, then the pain will be over so much more quickly. And it's not just the monetary pain, Ben, it's the emotional pain that people go through, because it's, in a sense, it's worse than someone dying, because the relationship is at an end, but that person's still out there circulating in the community, and you've got this sort of thing that you've got to deal with, and the sooner that you can resolve that, then the less emotional baggage or pain that you've got to carry through if it descends into litigation, and some do, Ben. Like, I don't settle. Yes. Unfortunately, you can't settle every case, and probably 10% of my work becomes litigious. And
when you say litigious, you mean goes to court, do you know? That's where barristers and lawyers, and then all of a sudden someone's buying a lawyer or a barrister their new Ferrari.
Correct. Or paying the next mortgage payment or whatever it might be.
Yes.
So in some cases, the consensus just can't be achieved. And there are some other cases where, unfortunately, the old term narcissism comes into play a bit. There's one party that just wants to show, they're on the way out. It's their last show of strength, their last, this is how it's going to be done type thing. And they'd rather spend the money on the lawyers than on the other party. And that's a bit sad, but that does happen. So some litigation occurs. I'm not afraid of a fight, not at all, but much prefer to have a happy client, make less money, have a happy client who's going to refer other clients to me for assistance than to have a client coming away feeling, holy, moly, I just blew 250 grand and what did I get?
I appreciate that. And at the end of the day, it's stressful enough as it is, and it's going to be difficult getting out to the other side. Before we did this, Murray, I did a little bit of Googling, and I love statistics. I've got a finance background and I love statistics, but I read something recently that 98% of statistics are made up on the spot, but I can guarantee I got these off Google, so I'm guessing they're right. So jokes aside, I'm not sure how accurate they are. But the interesting thing was I divorced around separation and Googling, and there was some documentation essentially saying that 27% of couples who divorce had trouble communicating, and 21% of marriages there was a loss of connection. So let's say a quarter of all people can't communicate properly. And when you put them in a position where they're having a dust up when it comes to kids and the divorce or money and the divorce, they're not going to get any better at communicating. And then also I read that 20% of partners separated over cheating or trust issues. Now, that's going to make it even worse, because then all of a sudden you've got an inflamed situation. Then you start talking about the kids or the money, etc. So realistically, that's a percentage that are going to be going into the negotiations very hot-headed. But the rest should be able to find them if they can be smart about it, an intelligent way of getting through. And I remember I have said this so many times to people over the years when it's come to disagreements, and this could be divorces, business split-ups, family issues, etc., is he or she who loses their cool first will lose the argument. And I think that's a really important thing to remember when you go into these discussions is if you lose your cool, you're out. And it doesn't matter what the other side's doing. You've essentially opened your hand, you poke a hand down, showed everyone what you're holding, and you could be buggered. The other thing we talked about was the whole, do you want to be happy or right? And having that opinion that I'm going to prove to Bill or to Mary, my ex-spouse, that I can beat them this time. And it's really adversarial. And I think the problem is with those people is they end up getting attracted to lawyers that have the same mentality, which is we'll fight every possible scenario because there's a financial interest in it. Have you found that finding a lawyer and choosing the right lawyer is incredibly important?
Ben, I can't emphasise that enough. Sadly, in my experience, and I'll be 60 shortly, so I've been around a while. In the family law sector of the last 10 years where I've operated almost exclusively, I've seen a combination of what you're talking about, a litigious adversarial approach to things. I've also seen a sluggishness in terms of getting things resolved. So matters just grind on, and you can't go faster than the other side sometimes. And finding another lawyer, we're a bit like doctors. We're like anyone else. There are going to be other lawyers that we relate to, that we feel we've got a trust and confidence with, and I can list those. And there are some, unfortunately, when you see that they're on the other side of something, you sort of brace yourself a little bit and you think, right, well, this is not going to be as straightforward as it could be. It is critical. And if I can just say this, if anyone ever rings me and says, look, I want a bulldog lawyer, I'm not that lawyer. I'm not interested in being your bulldog where, we're going to try and win at all costs. It's there's an old saying from commercial law, do you want to be right or do you want to be rich? I'd much rather be rich. You mentioned it before. And so the definition of compromise, because a family law property settlement usually involves compromise. We might be at a mediation, which is a typical part of the process to get things resolved. And I will find myself saying to a client, look, compromise is going to be required today. Now, to some extent, we look at all of the rights and the wrongs and the justice and equity, and whether it's fair or it's not fair. But at some point, you're probably going to have to move your thinking onto the actual position of compromise. And compromise is something that most people are not happy with, but they're prepared to live with in order to end the process. If you can have a good collaborative relationship between your lawyers, you have a far higher chance of your financial pain being limited in terms of getting your settlement done.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. Because nobody would ever come in, Murray, and go, we've got divorced, we're settling our property or our assets. Gee, I was happy with that outcome. I mean, that would never happen, would it? I mean, because we all want to get the best outcome for ourselves, especially in a divorce. So everyone is always going to be very unhappy or partially unhappy with the end divvy up. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it's a fair statement in most cases. There are some cases where, despite the fact that the relationship has died, there is still a respectful, almost loving relationship, between the former partners, and they don't, for that reason, want to have a fight. They've already decided what they're prepared to do, and look, they're fantastic. They're a lot cheaper to do. They're a lot easier to do, provided they fall, what they've agreed to falls within the range of what the court would authorise. So you get some of those.
Would that be more when there's kids involved, Murray? Mum and dad are there saying, look, we've decided to get divorced. It's relatively amicable, or maybe it's not amicable, but we've got kids involved and we don't want to drag this out and we just want to get it sorted and done. Is that sometime a common factor?
Sometimes. It's really a measure of the people involved. We've got one matter like that at the moment where, yes, there are 2 young kids. Neither of them has repartnered. And, both of them are in the health industry and they've decided, look, this is not working. And they're very respectful of each other. In fact, as a family lawyer, it's gratifying to see that happen. Most cases do require some negotiation between the parties, and that can often lead to a mediation having to be done. And I probably should mention, just without being too much of an aside, that the 2 courts that have always done family law property and parenting, for that matter — we haven't talked about parenting, we're focusing on property here — are the Federal Circuit Court and the Family Court. So few people would probably know that the Family Court only has always done the really high-level cases. 90% of the property settlement work has been done by the Federal Circuit Court, but they've now merged. So we've got the Federal Circuit and Family Court of Australia. And the rules have been updated. This only happened in September 2021, and the rules are now very heavily in favour of out-of-court settlements. Do not come here unless you have actually conducted a mediation. Even if you want to, you've got to do a mediation first. When the old sort of system, we'd try by direct negotiation. If that didn't happen, well, we'd often end up in court. We'd be told to go and mediate. And mediation is very effective when you've got a good, experienced mediator.
Because that's not your 2 lawyers getting together and having a confab with you in the room. It's having a separate facilitator who's specially trained and qualified to be able to do that.
Yes. And to the uninitiated, that might sound a little, soft, but I can assure you that where you've got an experienced mediator who will sit down and explain to the parties where they are in danger of going if they don't come to a compromise, that can frighten the living daylights out of some people. And they can be very good at slowly over the course of a day bringing the parties together and resolving the issue and having it dealt with, So very good. So we may well, be engaging in a lot more mediations prior to anything going to court in the future, I think.
think that's got to be a much better outcome for all parties involved. One of the other things, Murray, that I've always found is it can be terribly inflammatory and difficult is family and friends. Everyone's got an opinion when it comes to this scenario, and everyone's emotionally charged. Your friends can feel what you're going through, your family can feel what you're going through, and they aren't necessarily going to give a cool head to the scenario, and they're also not going to understand the technical complexities behind it all. And I've found over time a lot of people get themselves into strife when they've got, let's say they're recently separated and they have well-meaning but friends that might have been divorced or separated themselves recently, and there's this motivation to get you divorced, and this is what happened to me, and you need to fight this, and it can be quite agitating. And I've always suggested to people that it's incredibly important you be careful who you listen to and absorb the information, because they may have your best interests at heart, but they may not know what they're bloody talking about, but they also may just be wanting to have a fight with someone, like encouraging you to have a fight, and nobody wins that.
You're absolutely right. And what I say to any client of mine who mentions that they've spoken to someone else, the Divorced Persons Club president, for example, is, look, that's their circumstances. I do this every day. So I've probably got a better overall understanding of how things should go. And I may not agree with, something that's been proposed, but I'll have all of the reasons why I don't agree with that, or that I suggest a different approach, and that will all be to do with the Family Law Act itself. If I might just digress a moment, I went to a cardiologist a couple of months ago.
You've got a heart? You're a lawyer? You've got a
heart?
heart?
I'm a lawyer. I'm a decent bloke, but I happen to be a lawyer as well, you know.
So you've got an official medical certificate saying you're a lawyer and you've got a heart?
Yes. That's right. And so this cardiologist said, I want to put you on a statin. Now, I had read plenty about, statins, Dr. Google and all this sort of stuff. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. And he said, well, where are you getting your information from? I said, well, I've done, reading and, on the net and that sort of thing. He says, well, that's where you do your reading. What I read are the facts. What I read are the studies. I read them in detail. I know what I'm talking about. I can't make you take a statin, but I can assure you they're not anywhere near as dangerous as you may have the impression. I said to myself, Murray, you tell people that every day in your own business. Why don't you listen to this fella? So it's the same thing. Ultimately, people who are agitating on the side, it's not that prevalent. I don't see a lot of it. But if that's there, I can recognise that and just deal with that. Not in an abrupt manner, but just make sure that does not influence where we go.
Well, you're paying your accountant, you're paying your financial advisor, you're paying your lawyer for advice. Why the hell wouldn't you listen to them? I mean, you don't have to listen to everything they say. At the end of the day, advice is advice. You need to make your own choices. But at the end of the day, you're paying for it, so use that experience. So, Murray, I'd like to talk next and go off on a little bit of a tangent as well, back to something you mentioned before, which was the kids. And so is there a separate process for how the kids get dealt with? So child support or visitation rights, or who's got control of the children? Is that a third part of it? You've got the divorce, the property settlement, and then the kids, or are they all tied into the property settlement?
No, you're dead right. Children can have an impact on the property settlement in terms of if one party has the children, the majority of the time, then they have a greater financial impost upon them in caring for those children. And so it can impact on your property settlement. But what you're touching on there is the third major area of family law, and that is parenting. And unfortunately, some people just do not seem to be able to co-parent following the end of their relationship. It's difficult. Most people do sort it out, but parenting is an entirely separate area where the interests of the children are concerned. And there is a fourth, which is related to the parenting, and that is child support. So if anyone's wondering how do these all fit together, child support is done almost exclusively on the website. Child Support Australia, I think, is the new badged version of the website, but it's basically Centrelink.
So that's not a negotiation, Murray. That's like, let's negotiate what child support will be. It's essentially just, here are the figures, the government works it out and says this is what you've got to pay.
That's correct. You can negotiate it privately. A lot of people don't even go to the length of that and just agree, look, we'll pay And they do. If you want a documented agreement, you can do that either through a binding child support agreement or a child support agreement itself. Or most people where that's an issue, just go to the website, put in the number of days or nights per fortnight, etc., what their income is, and it spits out a figure which the other party pays. But that's specifically for child expenses. What I was mentioning a moment ago about parenting having an impact on your property settlement is more to do with how much money does it cost to accommodate a child. All of the indirect additional expenses that I won't use the word custodial parent, but the parent with the kids most of the time is going to have, or the imposition perhaps on their ability to go and earn an income because they're picking up, dropping off from school, working school hours, that type of thing. But to keep it a little simple or simpler, divorce, yep, easy. We've talked about that. Property settlement is always the elephant in the room in terms of money. It's big, can be very complex, or it can be not so complex, and not overly impacted upon by other things. And parenting, most people sort out parenting issues if they have them with the help of something called family dispute resolution practitioners, centre care. All the major charitable bodies do run these programs for free. You can access those, and they can often help you settle on a parenting agreement or a parenting plan that they write up, and that's what you operate off. If that doesn't work, well, okay, again, you can head off to court, but it's extremely expensive to go to court over parenting. Ben, if you can imagine this, that you spend, $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 fighting over your kids, and you get a piece of paper that says, well, the children are going to live with dad and they're going to be with mum every second weekend, etc. The kids are, say, 10 and 12 years old. In a couple of years' time, those children are going to be largely able to say what they want to do anyway. Girls from about 14, girls mature more quickly emotionally as well than boys do. Some 14, 15 onwards, girls can do what they want to do. So can boys from about 15 onwards. So you spend all of this money fighting over the kids for a piece of paper that's got a use-by date on it that, depending on how old the kids are, will determine what sort of value for money you're going to get out of all of that wastage. And I'm going to sound like an old Labrador here, but why wouldn't you have just spent that money on your kids? Why do you have to fight over that? It's so sad.
And the problem is, Murray, with all this is when you've got someone on the other side of the table who's agitated and has other people agitating, or even if you've got someone on the other side that's reasonably amicable, you can't control them. You can't control the lawyers, you can't control the law, but you can control yourself and you control the way you think, you can control the way you act. It may be incredibly difficult to do and it might take a lot of self-control, but the only thing you can control is yourself. And I think if people focus on controlling themselves, it may not work out exactly as they wanted it, but they're going to get a much better outcome than if they lose control and focus on trying to control all the other variables as well. What I want to dig into now, or just touch on, is two quick topics, Murray. The first one is, and I won't mention the second one just yet, but the first one is what about if the other party's hiding money? So they've maybe, like you said, took $180,000 out of the offset account, or they've squirreled away money you don't think you know about. And because that's a whole topic in itself, but really concisely, how do you account for that, shall I say, legally?
There's a really heavy emphasis in the Family Law Act on something called disclosure. So there's a basic package of disclosure that the Family Law Act says that you must provide to the other party. And that is, 12 months worth of bank statements that you've got, 3 years worth of income tax returns, notices of assessment, and your superannuation. Now, if you don't provide that to the other party, look, they might never know about something that's material. But if they do find out, if you've hidden something and that is later found out, then that is grounds for the other person to make an application to the court to have that settlement overturned. In which case, you, Mr. Clever Benjamin, that's hidden this money from your former spouse, you just wasted all the money you spent on your lawyers because you left yourself open. So, and it's a bit the same as in a commercial agreement. It's an agreement in the end. So, Ben, if you and I were going into business and I needed to have some sort of a qualification to be able to participate in that business, which you've got, And I say, yep, I've got that. And we go into business, we buy a business, whatever. And you say, Murray, where's your qualification? I say, oh, well, about that, there was a problem, And you look at me, if I had known that, Murray, I would never have taken the steps I did and agreed to do what we've done. So it's very much the same as that sort of thing. If you're going to misrepresent the other party what there is, and people do try, but we can usually find out anyway.
Do we get things like a forensic accountant in, for example? Because in a lot of cases, people have entities, especially in businesses, they've got companies and trusts, and accountants are trying to asset protect and help manage tax. And there's these complex webs that you may not understand. So getting someone like your accountant to get a forensic look through it and say, where's money gone? What's happened here? What other money's coming in, etc.? What other trusts are involved is really important, wouldn't you say, to be able to go through and work that out? And the second thing is sometimes these things just come out in the wash. 5 years has gone down track, and next thing, one of the kids is around at mum's place or dad's place, and then they say, oh, dad's, I don't know, for the lack of a term, investment unit down the coast that none of us knew about. We're staying down there. And they eventually come out in the wash in a lot of times, don't they?
Yes, and if you're going to, there are ways we can check. We can do title searches, and yes, we can engage forensic accountants where the finances are complex enough, because forensic accountants are expensive, so you've got to have some money involved there. So there's always going to be a pragmatic sort of a discussion to have there. And look, if, for example, we end up in proceedings, we can subpoena just about anything. You can run, but details. You can't hide. You just can't hide, mate. So
and the government now with the tax department, they know what's in your bank accounts. They can track money that's been floating around a lot easier than we could years before.
Yes. If I could just mention a service that we use for our clients for this disclosure, because it can be a bit onerous to be chasing up all these bank statements and so forth. There is a service which I'll give a quick plug to called Adieu, ADIEU, one-click disclosure. I can provide the link to them. They're a small social enterprise, and they have a system whereby, with our clients providing them with a very limited amount of information, they can go into the tax office and pull up all of their details. They can go into all their bank accounts, a bit like a mortgage broker can, and pull up all of their details and do all of that hard work for them, present it in the format that the court would want if it was to go to court. And it's an absolutely excellent service. So that's part of what we do to keep that process simple for our clients.
Yeah, and also make sure you don't miss anything. What about prenups? I mean, obviously we're talking about divorce, but we also need to think about when you're coming into new relationships. And I know prenups is something you hear about in especially American movies and TV shows. So our laws are completely different. But I heard someone say once, it's easier to make an agreement when you love each other than when you hate each other. And I think that's probably why these ideas of prenups became so popular. Do we have prenups here in Australia, and are they worth the paper they're written on? And I'll acknowledge the fact that every lawyer will have an opinion on their validity and every client's situation will be different. But do you see them? Are they like they appear in the movies, and can they be valuable for some people, especially if you've got significant assets?
We have them. They're not called prenups technically. They're called binding financial agreements. And you can do a binding financial agreement before a relationship, during a relationship, or at the end. More common there at the end. But there are limited circumstances where a prenup, as we'll call it, can sort of set the scene for what is to happen if the relationship doesn't survive. And usually it's where one has got a lot more than the other. And I generally find the most appropriate setting is where you've got perhaps a newly formed couple that might be in their 50s. They've generated, the majority of their wealth that they're going to generate. They've got adult children who are sitting in the wings, who they want to make sure are provided for. And barring complicated factors, they can pretty much say, look, if we do part company, this is what we want to do. And that can actually add to a relationship and not detract from the relationship. But it very much depends on the quality of the relationship itself. Prenups in the more movie sense of it are, sign here before we get married, and if you don't, we're not getting married. There is a host of problems that can arise with those. They've got to be very, very carefully done by the lawyers, and I suggest not quickly, and certainly never against the backdrop of, well, if you don't sign this document prepared by my lawyer on Friday, we're not walking down the aisle on Saturday. That is just
under duress.
Duress, and it's never going to stack up. So they tend to be heavily scrutinised by the courts if they are litigated upon, and the courts, as is their wont, will happily set them aside, even for the most inconsequential errors that might be in them. So they're a good idea, in my view, in limited circumstances. If they're done early in a relationship or between young people, you've really got a job on your hands to try to work out or anticipate what life events might lay ahead. So how many kids might we have if we separate after one child, two children, three, and so forth. And you can plan that out as closely as you can, but you can't predict things like a stroke or an aneurysm or other life events that can and would place a lot of pressure on the enforceability of a document like that if some allowance hadn't been built in for it.
So would you say it's fair to say that as time goes on, the document becomes potentially less effective legally because it waters down as time goes on? And if life events happen like an illness and someone can't provide for themselves, or they have children or build substantial assets together, then the prenup, for the lack of a better term, waters down and becomes less bulletproof in a court, shall I say.
Can I quote you on the legal principle you just mentioned there? Watered down and bulletproof in court. That's fantastic. I'll just make a note of that, Ben. Thank you. It's a little more refined in the assessment, but look, to me, that's the practical thing you've got to bear in mind.
I appreciate that. And the reality is everyone's, again, as we always say, everyone's situation's different, and it's very hard to put one size fits all.
Correct, yeah. Okay.
Well, that's been fantastic, Murray. I think we've probably scratched the surface on this. I know this is your area of focus, so we could talk for hours and days about the intricacies, but I think that's given us a really good introduction to it. My takeaways from this is that, if you can control yourself and think intelligently and try and limit your emotion and think, I want to get this done as quick as I can without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that's a good thing. What would be your number one suggestion?
I'd support that, Ben, and I would just say, look, I was referred, I was a proud early 50s male, and I was referred to a counsellor, and I thought, fair income, but I went along, and she taught me a bucket load of things on how to conduct myself, maintain the moral standards that you should have, or, that will serve you well. Don't get down into the grease pit and, give back as good as what you've just received. Keep your lid on it, and you will do far better, as you say. So that is a major thing for me. I firmly now believe in the quality and the benefit of good advice from quality counsellor type people, psychologists even, to maintain your mental acuity, your mental robustness, your emotional well-being through this period, and also to govern how you conduct yourself all the way through. Because everything you do, Ben, if you're going to be litigious, and if it ends up in court and you've behaved like a crazed pig of a man,
dingbat, as my grandfather used to say.
Yeah, well, you're not going to do yourselves any favours in front of most of the family law judges that I know. They can pick these sort of people. So if, on the other hand, you've behaved impeccably, they recognise and will reward that in the exercise of their discretion.
Appreciate that. Excellent. Where can people find you online, Murray?
We are CLO Lawyers. So the website is all lowercase, C for Charlie, L for Lima, O for Oscar, lawyers.com.au.
Fantastic. And I'll put that in the show notes, as well as links to any Facebook pages, etc. And my last question, which I like to ask almost everyone, Murray, is what's your definition of true wealth?
Well, yeah, we all know that money by itself doesn't make you happy. Having enough money out of your property settlement it's a bit like having enough oxygen to breathe again. But honestly, the feeling of true wealth, I think it's being able to enjoy the pleasure of giving. Whether that's, giving above and beyond in terms of a client of mine, and I've done plenty of that, or, Yeah, I think true wealth is just being able to take the pleasure of giving to someone else's circumstances.
Yeah, it's fantastic, Murray. I think that's a good definition. Well, thanks very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I know I've known you for quite a period of time, Murray, and I know that sincerely you always try and make sure that the objective is to get the best outcome for your clients, and quite often that is to remain, as you said, mentally robust, and also family relationships to remain intact as far as they can. So that's fantastic. I really appreciate your time, and yeah, thanks again.
Thank you, Ben. Pleasure.
So like most of these ones with lawyers and accountants, etc., is they're always fairly hefty topics, and we've only just scratched the surface, really. But here are a few key takeaways I think we got from the episode before I sign off. Number one, you can't control the other side of the disagreement. You can't control the lawyers, you can't control your ex-spouse, but you can control how you act. Murray mentioned that how you conduct yourself during the process will be taken into account by the judge should you go to court, and that could have a big impact on things. Number two, be careful who you surround yourself with and also who you listen to. Well-meaning people, including family, won't always help your situation. Number three, choose your lawyer carefully. You want someone that's technically good and will fight if required, but you want someone who's also concerned about you coming through the process with the best outcome possible for you and your family, and that includes your mental well-being. Number four, there are 3 parts of divorce you need to be aware of. The first part is the formal ending of the marriage. The second part is the property settlement. And the third part is dealing with the children. You'll need to go through those 3 separate, I suppose you'd say, sections. And finally, get some counselling to improve your mental resilience. It'll help you cope and remain calm. And in my experience, and also Murray's experience, calm, focused people always come out getting a better result. Now, it might be really, really tough to do that in this situation because emotions are high and there's a lot of anger involved, etc. But counsellors, the good ones, will be able to help you build those tools to get that resilience, which you're going to need. So that's it for this episode. Remember, you can join our new private Facebook group, The Financial Blokes Wealth and Wisdom, but please share this with your family and friends if you enjoyed it, because you just never know where people are in their lives and this could have some value for them. Also, like us on the socials, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or some other service, if you could follow us or give us a rating, that'd be absolutely fantastic. Thanks for joining me again today, and I'll catch you with a new episode in 2 weeks' time.